Hi everyone, I'm Caleb, and today I'm going to be presenting on Tristan Cotton's transgender migrations, specifically concerning Neil Bonji's Chapter 9, Transcriptions, as well as Riley Snorton's Chapter 6, Passing for White, Passing for Man. We're going to be looking at how attachment to concepts of home, the journeys they involve, and the potential for transgression of emotional or corporeal borders affects our idea of community, with specific focus on how post-colonial diaspora has a potential to disrupt normative narratives of belonging within trans identity. I want to start this presentation by looking at the quote that Bonji chose to open Chapter 9, written by Arjun Appadurai, a famous anthropologist, from his article Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy. In this, he suggests that conversations surrounding cultural tensions fail to consider the gray areas that lay between cultural homogenization and heterogeneity. It's that gray area that Bonji is aiming to dissect in this chapter by criticizing transsexuality and transgender for their limiting of trans as a concept and what it means to belong. We're still failing almost 20 years after Disjuncture and Difference was published to problematize the boundaries constructed around a term that means to travel across, through, and beyond. Some questions to consider throughout the presentation. Is it possible to form a community without the exclusion of others? Where are the guidelines for successful trans identity constructed in relation to the body and in relation to someone's national identity? Just to cover all of my bases, I want to make sure everybody's clear on diaspora before moving on. The term encompasses migrants, immigrants, and those living in exile. In expressing trans identity through the narrative of journey, that is a linear timeline with a clear start and a clear finish, those that are forced to reside outside of that, unable to reach a successful end due to intersectional issues, are forced to inhabit that inhospitable gray area in between. Situated in post-colonial nationalistic context, these failings manifest in opposition to naturalized cultural norms. In the North American context, Black trans people are unable to achieve whiteness, and therefore are likely unable to arrive home in a society in which Black bodies are ostracized. Similarly, gender-variant identities are unable to arrive home in their bodies due to the strict masculinities and femininities that cling to our heteronormative culture. While bringing home and away into a state of tension can expose the links between subjective processes of inclusion and belonging, Bonji also makes a point of critiquing the umbrella of diaspora studies for implying that journeys of diasporic populations are homogeneous, while at the same time detracting from the idea that all movement is diasporic. Additionally, the individualism present in this framework can imply that everybody's ideas and identities are all valid and therefore not up for debate. These are just things to keep in mind while I move forward. So what is home? There's two terms up here, but I'll start with the sandwich quote in the center. There's difference between feeling at home and labeling a space at home, between the desire for home and the homeland itself. So again, we're looking at the distinction between the feeling of home in the self and the physical space that home can embody. Freud's concept of Heimlich refers to the feeling of being at home, which he conceptualizes to be something that resides in the heart rather than physical space. So Freud kind of opens up this whole concept of home being something that can be within the self. And then building on that, Avtar Brad's analysis of homing desires, that is, the desire for home as an embodied concept rather than a longing for physical space or homeland, is hugely influential on this chapter 9 that is. Brad's theory severs the concept of home as embodiment from the idea of a physical place to be returned to, thereby disrupting the linear homecoming narratives present in the majority of trans scholarship that fail to be intersectional. In making this distinction, there's opportunity to pit trans identity and borders against one another to open up that gray space into a dialogue. This brings trans identity into conflict with concepts of nationalism and identity, providing a lens to draw the conclusion that, for example, because transsexual as a term is a Western construct, that the transsexual citizen is located in Anglo-American values and norms. It's Jay Prosser who brings the concept of transsexual and transit together, suggesting that transition is a narrative parallel to immigration, where the body becomes the site for movement rather than the physical borders of land. He's discussed in both chapters 6 and 9, as he believes transsexuality has always embraced notions of place, location, and specificity. He views gender dysphoria as akin to the feeling of living without a skin of one's own, and he, along with Sarah Ahmed, view the skin as at once an external and internal state of homeliness, where home is your ability to engage with yourself and outwardly with others. This allows us to engage Butler's performativity theory with intersectional issues of transness and what it means to be able to pass. Concepts such as being white passing, running parallel to being female passing or male passing or whatever gender you're trying to present as passing in modern culture highlights this concept, and I'll be coming back to this idea in a few slides. So first of all, I'm just going to say Fix-It Felix is up here for transfixed because no one's going to tell me that Fix-It Felix is not transgender. So let's just move on with that. So I want to delve a bit more into crossing the borders of the skin. In chapter 9, we looked at transition as a journey across borders. In chapter 8, we looked at transition as a journey across borders. But what really happens when those borders are situated within the self instead? Sarah Ahmed suggests that the boundaries between self and home in a way, are both permeable. As a result, those who choose to embark on their journey with no intention or with no way of reaching the other side directly disrupt transnormative concepts of transition as a journey with a clear start and a clear end by remaining indefinitely in that gray area. To fix the self suggests something is missing, broken, or residing in the unheimlich of Freud's imaginings. However, transnormative narratives fail to embody lived trans experiences. As someone who's made the choice to remain situated in that gray area, I generally get one of two responses when I'm asked about my intentions with hormone therapy or with sexual reassignment surgery. And when people ask me about whether I intend to have a bottom surgery, as in like a genital surgery, my answer of no is either met with surprise that I would disrupt the narrative of what it means to be transgender that people are kind of sold in normative culture, or it's met with understanding, but that understanding is usually not due to an acceptance of my body, but rather like an empathetic response to the fact that bottom surgery is usually very expensive, experimental, invasive, painful, or like very emotionally intensive. And I think if there were kind of like a quote unquote penis on button in the back of a hospital somewhere, that the responses I would get for disrupting that narrative would be a lot more critical. So I'm sure everybody's kind of heard of this concept of trans being related to the feeling as if one was born in the wrong body. It's become so popularized that there's now a UK TV program with the same name that chronicles the transitions of young trans men. The flaws in this narrative really seem to stand out when looking at things through a lens of trans diaspora, which allow us to dismantle the idea that home and belonging are sedimentary, fixed, or unchanging states. This isn't to really invalidate trans people who find comfort in this narrative, and a lot of the chapter does express that a lot of trans people do identify with like the idea of wanting to take their skin off or wanting to put a new skin on, being born in the wrong body, being formed in the wrong body, etc. But the narrative has been popularized in North American transnormative context that kind of fail to acknowledge those who choose to live contrarily to feeling out of home or in pre or post-op bodies. So I'd like to suggest that feelings of being outside of the quote-unquote correct body may stem from both internal and external responses if performativity theory is to be followed. Additionally, transnormative narratives are wrapped up in this neoliberal discourse that suggests that the individual is responsible for their own feelings of unbelonging, which kind of fails to acknowledge the intersectional challenges that many trans people face as a response to the normative cultures that dictate which bodies have access to belonging and which do not. So I'm just going to show a quick clip that's like 1 minute and 30 seconds of the start of this show. Here.
Across Britain, girls humming. Men. Transgender people once felt the need to hide in the shadows, but the next generation are bearing their all online.
I got my first appointment 2 months, 9 months, 18 months, 34 months.
They're sharing the secrets of how they change their bodies.
Did you see it? Yeah.
From female to male. We'll follow 3 young men who were born girls.
It doesn't even look like the same person as me mental.
For the most important year of their lives, they'll take drastic steps from injecting testosterone
It's kind of like the start of the rest of my life, and it's just in this little bottle.
to removing their breasts
I'm glad we did the Johnson.
and even constructing their very own penises.
People have asked for 8, 9 inches. They're not making porn stars.
They'll leave the girls they were behind.
I had a daughter and I lost her. Sorry. You trying to fucking go kill yourself?
To become the men they've always wanted to be.
I wonder how many men are go through this. Thanks for fun, guys.
So you can kind of see that this is very like a normative storyline. You know, everybody in this video is white, and they're all kind of repeating the same trans narratives that we've heard a million times before. Could totally apply to them, maybe doesn't, you know. So with all of that said, I want to pose some discussion questions. So many medical professionals actually have required trans patients to live socially as their chosen gender, sometimes with a mandate of like more than a year before they're actually allowed access to hormone treatment. So while pushing trans people into nonlinear progressions of social and medical transition does have the potential to disrupt linear and normative narratives of the gendered border crossing, the practical applications often result in stress and failure, as socially passing is often impossible without hormone treatment. And of course, by passing, I mean achieving cis-normative presentations of male or female gender. Part of Bra's analysis involves conceiving home as directly connected to exclusion and inclusion. Do you guys think this holds up? Where not passing will not allow you to feel at home in your skin due to the exclusionary nature of physical non-recognition by others. If the in-between space of gender transition figures as a site of future homely possibility, is it possible to locate a sense of home after undergoing social transition without the medical aspect? And I would also like to ask how your answer to this would change when discussing white bodies versus POC bodies, people of color, maybe even disabled bodies, bodies that are clearly not holding up to normative cultural standards. So what happens when you're born into a body that's coded culturally or physically wrong in more than one way? As Halberstam recognizes here, there's a huge difference between becoming a black man or a man of color and becoming a white man. There's also a significant difference between moving away from the identity of a black woman versus a white woman, or, you know, the opposite if we're talking about trans women. I want to briefly return to the idea of a transsexual citizen being located in Anglo-American values and norms, thereby situating transsexual and transgender narratives in white privilege. While a trans person of color may be able to pass through the borders of social transgressions, for example, Laverne Cox, who's become very successful as a black trans woman in normative media, they're still hindered by systemic and cultural discrimination and thus not properly oriented towards a homecoming. So where sex and gender and race intersect, passing kind of transcends the possibilities of even hormone treatment or sexual reassignment surgery in bringing a trans body into a state of home within Anglo-American culture. Bonji talks about his experiences working within a health collective to try and develop a questionnaire for trans people in Canada, Growing up in a white town, he says he was really extremely aware of his physical differences. He was like the only non-white person. And when he got into the meeting room, he was really affronted by all of the non-racialized white bodies in the room, asking how race could actually have anything to do with being trans, as if a racialized body can be separated from the gendered one. So in terms of transgender yearnings, which we have here, in keeping with Banji's experience, the protagonist in the autobiography of an ex-colored man, which is the book that is examined in chapter 6, the protagonist only becomes aware that he isn't white when confronted by his peers. And this sort of seems like an experience that I've heard of before from many people of color, where it's kind of, actually I've heard this a lot from people who immigrate to other countries from Africa, where they don't realize that they are considered black until they're put in a situation where, you know, their body is suddenly not the normalized body. So for Banji and also for the protagonist in the autobiography, race is mapped onto their skin for them. And in the book, despite the protagonist being mixed race, which suspends him in that unacceptable gray area of identity crossing, he's still kind of ostracized by it. So what happens when your body fails to perform expected norms? You're denied a sense of home and kind of held suspended by others' perceptions of you. The experience of trans minorities living in diaspora positions their existence as the very cause of the disruption that they feel. Their otherness, which is projected onto them by others, is in turn what makes them feel othered. So it's kind of this horrible catch-22. Riley Snorton draws on Martin Summers to discuss the intersections of gender, race, and passing as performativity in this novel. In stating that passing inverts the logic of autobiography by providing a narrative that stages the social world personified in the individual rather than an individual story illuminating larger aspects of society, he reads the novel as a satire of a non-fictional autobiography, because this is a fictional autobiography, which disrupts trans narratives of homecoming by highlighting racialized limitations. So in the novel, they kind of go over this concept of beauty is whiteness, beauty is feminine, so whiteness is feminine, and therefore the protagonist longing for whiteness also means that he's longing for femininity and vice versa. So the historical context of the novel seemed very important to me. Published originally in 1912, it's noted that at the time, homosexuality was understood as actually very discernible on the physical body, mirroring the visual logics of race. Snorton's analysis centers performativity of intersectional trans yearnings, theorizing that in order to become a man, the protagonist must contest with becoming a black man specifically, and all that it means to be racialized as black, both internal and external, as well as everything it means to be gendered as a man. Additionally, in conflating homosexuality and race, whiteness is brought into conflict with femininity, thereby associating masculinity with blackness. As a character of mixed race, the protagonist wars with his fair skin and the beauty that's mapped onto that in Anglo-American context. As he yearns for femininity, he therefore is yearning for whiteness. He looks down upon his mother for her darker skin, recognizing it as a failing in her femininity. In the end, he also puts all of his pride in his children, who have allowed him to further recognize whiteness in himself through their Anglo-American features. Most importantly, however, the protagonist makes a conscious choice to grow his facial hair at the end and pass as a white man, while assuming a male identity as well, recognizing his race rather than his gender for its performative possibilities, and thereby becoming X-raced, as in an ex-black person. Sarah Ahmed theorizes that it's ultimately whiteness that allows for the linear extension of a properly oriented body through space. In the end, readers must look to how the protagonist transverses multiple sites of identification through the productive art of passing to effectively dissect how intersectionalities disrupt the potential for homeliness in the non-white trans body. In Canada, we like to toot our society for being multicultural. However, the recognition of home for some arrives at the expense of the permanent dislocation of home for racialized others, who, living in white supremacist contexts, are constantly denied a state of belonging. For the racialized trans body, this is a total double whammy. To conclude would suggest that there's any sure conclusion to be drawn from all of this, so instead I'd like to leave off by discussing where we can go from here. Trans as a term is evocative of the transgressions, transmogrifications, and transmutations of established norms. To adopt a trans identity is to transcend borders, boundaries, and the social bylaws that dictate what a body should or should not be, or what space it should or should not be entitled to. The concept of passing has the potential to deny these spatial transformations, even as it can be enacted to protect the individual, such as in the book that was analyzed, where it is stated that although the protagonist decides to sort of abandon his Black identity, he does so for the sake of his economic gain. He kind of does it to become normative and become part of a normative society in order to gain the privileges that a non-trans or a non-queered white person would have access to. So, yeah. But it's important to note that not all diasporic or racialized bodies can achieve a state of passing, because unlike the protagonist, not everybody is mixed. Not everybody has fair skin. Not everybody can grow a mustache and become a white man. So therefore, the state of belonging and the resultant feeling of home with themselves is kind of displaced. Bonji notes that even though metaphors of travel and border crossing are inevitable in transsexual discourses, we must recognize that they're also laden with the histories of other identity negotiations, and they carry the burden of national and colonial discursive histories. So to finish, I just want to ask a couple of questions, because that's, moving forward, all we can do is ask a few more questions. Is there a way to reconcile this exclusion without falling into the untouchable, individualized bubble that some of the authors talked about? Is there a way to mediate the exclusion without, how can I say this? Without making it so that everybody's individualized, self-declared identities thereby become unable to be critiqued. And though it's easier said than done, dislocating concepts of belonging from the formulations of home in the self may prove more accessible as we continue to queer the inner walls of the Canadian melting pot. And yeah, that's the end. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Had a lot of fun with it. And yeah, all right.